Okay, greetings from Australia. I'm Raewyn Connell. Thank you for inviting me to your Congress. I'm delighted to have the invitation. Sorry I can't be with you personally. It's just a long way across the Pacific Ocean. But I'm glad to be able to speak to you through video. I think these are interesting times for teachers now. If you look at the polls and surveys about public opinion, education is constantly at the top of the ranking of important issues according to the general people. And politicians respond to this in a certain way. So you'll often find an incoming president, for instance, declaring that he or sometimes she wants to be known as the education president. And indeed, the system is still expanding. Levels of literacy are still rising globally, and higher education in particular has expanded tremendously in the last generation. We now have more than 200 million students in higher education worldwide. So there's a lot positive, you would think, for the education system and for the work of teachers. And yet there are also toxic things going on, toxic policies adopted by governments that increase the levels of anxiety in education, the levels of competition which make it more difficult to work cooperatively in teaching. And when we look at the social composition of education, we see really vast inequalities. If you look at, for instance, in higher education, the sector where I have mostly worked, the rich universities of the global north, universities like Harvard, for instance, have many billions of dollars of endowment, of wealth available to them, whereas the massive universities in the global south are scratching for resources all the time. There are just enormous inequalities. And when we look at international policy about education, we see, provisions such as the PISA tests of so-called school achievement, serve very little positive purpose, but do raise stress and anxiety about school systems tremendously. And in many parts of the world, there's simply a growing gap between the resources available for private schools, especially elite private schools, and the mass of public schools, which serve the less advantaged half of the population. So with all that going on, you might well ask, why would anyone be a teacher? Why would anyone join this profession anyway? And I think there is an answer. It's not that we're going to make dollars. It's not that we're going to get rich by teaching. None of us will get rich by teaching. But most of us, I think, are in the profession as teachers at whatever level, from kindergarten through to university, for one reason being that we like working with students. We want a profession where we can serve the community, where we can serve the public interest. And we believe that knowledge matters, that what we are doing is genuinely important for the future of humanity. And I think all of those reasons are valid. They are right. And that connects to what we actually mean by education. Now, I'm an academic, so of course I try to define my terms. And I do have a definition of education. Not necessarily easy to come up with, but anyway, my definition of education is that when we're educating, we're engaged in forming and nurturing capacities for practice. That's what education is, the formation and nurturing of capacities for practice. Those capacities may be individual, related to the individual student. the pupil in the classroom, or they may be the collective capacities of the whole society. Education works at both those levels, as I think most teachers understand. We produce social effects and we produce effects in individual lives. Now that notion of what education is as the nurturing of capacities for practice leads to a very, very particular view of what good education is. So to me, good education is always practical. It's concerned with the real world in all its aspects. It's sustainable. It's concerned with the welfare of society over time. It's pro-social. It's engaged in producing effects. Good education is concerned with social justice, with the usefulness of knowledge, with the benefits, if you like, for the whole of the community that come from our work as educators. Now that means that education necessarily has a wide scope. It's something that operates across, which cannot ultimately be separated out. It operates across the whole population. It operates across the whole perspective of social life. It's not something that is narrow or separated off. So that when we formulate the goals of education, for instance, in terms of the formation of a competent citizen or the facilitation of a good social life, we're saying that good education is inherently democratic. It's not something that can separate people, as bad education constantly does. So to my mind, the privatization of education at any level, or the creation of educational institutions that exclude certain groups, certain populations, certain types of pupils, is basically contrary to the logic of education itself. Good education is inherently creative, and that follows, I think, from the nature of learning, because when the pupil learns, it's not a matter of knowledge transfer, it's not a matter of the knowledge in the head of the teacher being poured into the head of the pupil, like pouring water from a jug into a glass. That's not education at all. The nature of education is the building by the pupil of structures of action and knowledge that enable new practice to occur. And the teacher's role is not that of a kind of outside controller of this process. The teacher's role is more like that of a midwife, a facilitator, a companion in the process of learning for the pupil, the individual pupil, the group of pupils, or the whole of the society considered as learners. That's the scope of good education. That's an ambitious goal, but one that we constantly work towards in our everyday work as teachers. Now, when we look back into our history, and I'm thinking here particularly of countries like Argentina and Australia, that is post-colonial countries, we see that the democratic logic of education is very frequently violated, has been very frequently violated by the way education has been organised. So our school systems, our higher education, university systems were actually born segregated. Colonial school systems, for instance, were segregated on the basis of class. Usually indigenous people were excluded from them. They were segregated on the basis of gender, so that girls' education and boys' education was often affected in separate schools. Women for a long time were excluded from higher education at all. Education systems often segregated people on the basis of economic class, segregating the rich from the poor, from the middle. And you had basically curricula in colonial education systems that were oriented to stabilising and reproducing the colonial power itself. Now, that was a feature of our history, though we can't deny that there is a long history of unjust education, segregated education, which made creative, inclusive, and just education difficult to bring off. Yet many people always wanted to do that. Many teachers have always fought for a just, inclusive and creative educational experience, and to make the institutions, the schools and universities themselves, more inclusive and creative. So there's a history of struggle in our education systems, as well as histories of exclusion and injustice. There have been many struggles, for instance, for access to advanced levels of education. That was a major issue for the women's movement in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and has had very, very large measure of success. There were struggles to transform curriculum, to make pedagogies more inclusive and democratic than the old top-down models of knowledge transfer. There have been attempts to widen curricula, to make curricula more socially inclusive and socially relevant to formerly excluded groups. And that history of struggle is actually, a key part of the history of teaching as a profession, because it's progressive teachers, above all, who've led those struggles and carried them through to the degree of success, partial success, that we've now had. And that has happened all over the world. We have actually, in the last 2 generations since the mid-20th century, seen major increases in the access that girls have to schooling, that women have to literacy. We now have mass literacy on a world scale, which is historically unique and really important for the nature of our society and the kinds of futures we might have. And we've had broadening of curricula beyond old, either strictly vocational or strictly academic curricula. We've had a great deal of innovation and broadening in the curricula that's possible to teach, both in schools and in higher education. And I think we can celebrate those advances, those historic advances that have been achieved to a very large extent by teacher activism over the last couple of 100 years. So we have much to celebrate, but we also have struggles on our hands now. And I guess I think of the present day as a kind of new era of struggle, when the old empires, the old imperial relationships between global north and global south have been transformed, not necessarily by more equality on a world scale, but by new power centres. We now live in an age where our economies are dominated by transnational corporations and global markets, where our political systems are strongly influenced by a neoliberal ideology that attempts to privatise public assets, public resources, and fetishizes the market as the way to make social decisions. And even more recently, we've seen around the world, and you see this in your environment as I see it in the Western Pacific, we see the rise of authoritarian governments and the rise of social and sometimes state violence. We've seen proliferation of nuclear weapons. We've seen an extraordinary disregard of the looming crisis of climate change. This is not an easy moment of history for us to be working in. We've had backlashes against progressive developments And those backlashes have had a real impact on education, on the work of teachers at all levels. Some of you, I'm sure, pardon me, will have had struggles about management, about central control over curricula, over pedagogical practices, over testing, assessment, over the imposition of measurement regimes which hamper the creativity of teaching. Some of you will have had struggles with the so-called anti-gender movement, which attempts to push us back into much more unequal and conservative patterns of gender relations. Many of you will be aware of the way neoliberal governments in many parts of the world have been cutting taxes and putting more money into the pockets of the wealthy while shrinking the resources that are available for public services such as education. These matter for teachers in general terms and sometimes very specifically. Those backlash politics impact what can be done in schools and universities, particularly through the impact of the privatisation and competition agenda, which has had a very significant impact on education itself. We've seen that, for instance, with the role of the OECD, the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the rich countries' club for neoliberal policy making. And it is striking to me that it is the OECD as an organisation which has taken over the international educational testing agenda through the PISA system, which, of course, produces knowledge that's not particularly useful for teachers in the classroom, but creates competitive ranking scales for countries and for school systems, increasing anxiety, levels of competition, and decreasing the possibilities for cooperation. That's the kind of impact that we are now seeing on the school system. And in both schools and higher education, we've seen a tendency as managerial control of school systems has increased to treat individual schools not as cooperating parts of a cooperating public sector, but as individual firms which are supposed to compete with each other for money and for students and for reputation. And this has developed to a really toxic level in the university sector, particularly where universities have university managers now think of themselves basically as corporate managers engaged in putting down their rivals rather than setting up patterns of interaction and cooperation to make the university system work for social purposes at the level of the whole society. So, talking about neoliberalism, about the market agenda, about the rise of corporate power is not a marginal issue for educators anymore. It affects our work, it affects our institutions very directly. And it affects them, in the heart of what good education is about. That is, in terms of curriculum and organisational justice. Because the neoliberal agenda is built on social exclusion. It creates exclusion as a key mechanism in setting up hierarchies and increasing competition within the education sector. And thus the rise of mechanisms like fees for schools and universities, league tables, public subsidies for private education institutions, and so on, are all about creating social exclusion through university systems. And that to me is deeply depressing, in fact distressing, It seems to me to undermine the rationale of good education, to undermine what teaching is really about. Well, that's all the bad news, but I want to finish on some of the good news, or some of the good ideas that offer alternatives in education, other ways that school and university systems can develop. I mentioned the concept of curricular justice, or justice in curriculum, and I want to point to the way that curriculum thinking itself can embody issues of ideas of social justice. Curricular justice is about curriculum that prioritize the advantages of that prioritize the interests of the least advantaged social groups rather than the most advantaged. And that seems to me an important criteria for teachers' work. We know we are doing well when pupils from the least advantaged social groups are finding schools and universities good places to be, where they feel comfortable and are able to learn effectively as any other social group. Now, to do that involves rethinking curricula at a pretty basic level. We do need to widen the resources that we can draw on in constructing curricula. So I think it's important to look at knowledge resources outside the usual sources of the school and university curriculum. We need to look at Indigenous knowledge formations. We need to look at the many forms of local knowledge that don't necessarily come from Indigenous communities, but from the ways of life of the bulk of the people. We need to look at the multiple knowledge formations that exist around the world as cultural resources that can be drawn on by teachers in constructing teacher-driven curricula for our schools and universities. Good education and good educators have a commitment to truth, which, as every researcher knows, is difficult to establish, but very important as a criterion for what we are doing, and also have a commitment to social service. And it's those commitments, I think, that drive concern with, for instance, sexuality education, with education about the environment, the kinds of educational issues that are now being attacked by right-wing forces. And those are important for our work as teachers, because as teachers we are implicitly against ignorance. We struggle against ignorance in our everyday work and should be doing that in our planning too, drawing on the wealth of knowledge resources that now exist in the world. Now, to do that, in the long run, we also need to be concerned with our own workforce. The workforce of education has to be sustainable over the long term in order to have a good education system. And therefore we need to be concerned to struggle against the casualisation of teaching in schools and in higher education where casualisation is rampant. We need to be concerned with controlling the stresses that teachers are under. And we need to be concerned with the conditions of the non-teaching staff in schools and universities too, who are a very important part of our collective work as educators who also make schools and universities work as educational institutions. And through all of that, we need to be concerned to maximise the creativity of the coal-faced, the chalk-faced workers in education. Creativity is the core of the educational process. The creativity of the teachers and the creativity of the learners, above all, we have to maximise. And that means that we have to oppose the imposition of top-down templates or controls over what we are doing. We need to oppose the expansion of managerial control in education, and maximise the creativity of the actual workforce. That is crucial to advance in education. I think these issues create enormous responsibility for educators. I don't think we have an easy life as teachers and researchers. This is a tough world to be working in. But I also think there are enormous opportunities for creative work in schools and in higher education. And I'm delighted, therefore, to be able to offer you these ideas, and I wish you well in your future work.